Good evening. Today we are actually very happy to have three of very eminent scholars with us, and writing of at least one has influenced us beyond journalism and other things. But two of you are here, and I have been reading part of your writing, and in fact, in some sense, I've been last five. 5 or 6 years have been part of, and actually have been very fond of a serial, and through that I've started writing on crime serial. There's a border town with Kari as the protagonist. So in that sense, my introduction to the Finnish history, contemporary history, I'm a historian by profession, and then I started this Center for Media Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University. But since we started, the country was also going through a turmoil of a different kind. So therefore, the center becomes a kind of center which is watching everything, but not able to come up to it because it's just a very small baby, 6, 7 years old. It is in this sense that I want to engage all of you in an academic discussion on the issue of freedom, issue of journalism, issue of media. And to the audience, they might have very immediate sense of understanding as to why India slipped and why Nordic countries have scored very high in this report, as it was happening in the last couple of reports. I remember 5 years back, I was participating in a TV program where, again, the same issue was discussed. And I try to connect it with the human development indexes and press freedom indexes. But the discussion did not go that far. So discuss all of these issues together with your very deep engagement with the issue of journalism, the issue of minority identity, the issue of European Union itself and what is happening in Europe today. All of this together actually brings us to a very nice evening. I am promising a very, very nice evening. With these words, let me welcome Professor Thomas Wahlgren. Professor Wahlgren has been professor at University of Helsinki. We have Tom Moring, again, University of Helsinki and Swedish Academy of Social Sciences, and Gunnar Nygren from Department of Social Sciences, Södertörn University, where I have a colleague working on famine and humanitarian aids, Norbert Godts, very fantastic historian. So with these words, these are some of the finest scholars on the issues that we are going to discuss today. So with these words, let me welcome, and I leave all three of you have 2 minutes each to introduce yourself in a different way than I did just now. Thank you. We start with Tom Moring. Professor Moring.
Yes, Professor Bataviar, I am very, very happy to be with you today. You gave an excellent, maybe a little bit exaggerated presentation of at least my expertise, but I have followed this and worked in this field since I was 19 years old in different capacities. Now I'm a emeritus professor and all, of course, still working. Professors never stop, but one would say that the development in the media sector today is so fast and it's so dramatic that it will be very interesting to listen to also your experiences and see how you in your part of the world have experienced this. The first introduction with the Guinness Record Book notation of more than 500 issues administered by one person is impressive indeed. That has to do with the multilinguality, of course, also of India and the cultural diversity you have in your country, which is, of course, also a thing that is very different from our part of the world.
That's true. Preservation is an issue here because of the weather, the climate, and all. There is a library in Bhopal called Sapre Library, which is the only museum, not library, it's a museum of newspaper. And so it's a fantastic library. So people have been personally, individually, collectively collecting, but the issue of preservation has become too important today. One is digitization is happening at the same time. At the same time, people are not having the space to keep all these holdings. So families have, unlike Finland, where you have wooden houses, we have different kind of houses which are becoming a kind of passe in the sense. With these words, let me invite Professor Nygren. Professor Nygren, why don't you have the introduction?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take part in this seminar. And as Professor Moring, I'm looking forward to also hear about experience from Indian journalism that I am not so familiar with. My research area, I'm a senior professor in journalism at Södertörn University, and my areas has been very much about the professionalization of journalism, professional autonomy, and the role of journalists in a democratic society. And in connection to that, I've been researching both democratic and authoritarian societies like Russia, for example. So I think these issues of press freedom are crucial in today's world, and will be interesting to discuss them today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And now, Professor Wallgren, Thomas Wallgren.
Thank you. Thank you all for having this occasion to meet you. I'm professor of philosophy and also a social activist in Finland with some exposure, luckily, to friends in India, especially to the Gandhian tradition, which has inspired me a lot since 1987 when I first came to Delhi. I've been maybe 20 times after that for some visits of research and also activism. My expertise, my research is not in journalism and press freedom. My research is on the foundations of democracy in the Western tradition, the connections between nonviolence and democracy and truth. I was with the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas in the 1980s, who's thought to be one of the most prominent contemporary theorists of democracy in the Western world. And later I have been engaged in studying the foundations of our democracy theory also through Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher of language and moral philosopher. So that's where I come from. One foot in activism, environment, development, solidarity, and democracy. Another foot here in my office at the University of Helsinki. Glad to see you all.
I hope you had three foot, so to say, so that you could have a foot in India. And since you work on continental and analytic, both philosophy and therefore additionally Gandhi and Gandhian philosophy adds to whatever you're doing. In that sense, I was quite surprised yesterday when one of our students, when I sent a link, he said, "Is it the same Wallgren who wrote Transformative Politics?" I said, "Yeah, Transformative Philosophy." I said, "Yeah, I have to check it because the exact title I didn't know." So that means the current generation of students who are slightly becoming living in a sense of hopelessness. One of your paper talked about hopeless situation in some sense, where the technology is noisy and creating a kind of hopeless situation in many parts. There are generations around, young people around, who are trying to see hope. Maybe through this discussion, there's some glimmer of hope comes to our young generation. With these words, let me now open up the discussion between three of you first, and then we will join. We will join first. For the audience, this is the press freedom in Finland is not just one sector of the freedom, but there are other things attached to it. A kind of political activism, the kind of history they had, the kind of socialism, the discussion of socialism, the discussion of nationalism. It's not that it's a hunky-dory story there. There are people also fighting for different kinds of rights, social rights, individual rights, minority rights, for example. Today itself, one of a very close friend of ours, Professor Philip Thayer, I don't know whether you're familiar with his work, Europe since in 1989. His book on the refugees in Europe, he just put on the Facebook that his Spanish edition has come, is the mass migration in Europe. So in that sense, Europe is not just a hunky-dory where freedom is just there. They also are struggling, as we might be struggling today to keep certain kind of freedom. So it is in this background I want to pose the first question to three of you as to what is the context in which in this report has come to you, where the report, maybe report is a new one, but other things were happening before that. Since all of us here in the university, we are researching slightly much more than just today's context. So it is in which context that you see this freedom of journalism, freedom of press, freedom of media in your country, and so that we can get a sense of that context. Professor, we can start with Professor Valgren himself.
Thank you. Well, for me, the context, one sort of acute context in Finland at the moment is the tension between our two main traditions of self-understanding of our liberal democracy, where since through the modern era, we have had this competition between two ways of describing the need for democracy, where one comes from the more pessimistic view of man, the Hobbesian, the British early Enlightenment tradition, in which society was thought of as built of individuals who are at odds with each other, who don't understand with each other, who compete with each other, but who have preferences and want to come to agreement about how to adjudicate or balance the differences between their preferences. So that is the atomistic, the market liberal idea of society, in which the press is needed as a kind of mechanism for weighing preferences and the distribution in society. And the other tradition, the stronger, the richer view of the need for democracy and freedom of press and the need for civil rights comes then has a longer history going back to Socrates and the Athenian democracy, especially the philosopher Socrates in Athens 400 before Christ, but has then later been developed in Enlightenment philosophy, especially through Immanuel Kant and Jürgen Habermas and others, where the idea is that we are shaped as social individuals through the dialogue with others. We don't come with ready-made preferences. Our desires, our wishes, our goals in life, our values are shaped in intimate and ongoing conversation with others. And in a complex society, this conversation through which we will only be able to develop our sense of self together with others. In a complex society, this conversation will have to involve not only the people I meet day to day, but also people whom I never meet, but whose ideas, whose wishes, desires I need to understand. So we have these two moments. I need the engagement with my closest fellows. I need the mediation through press, so I could reach out, and my community can be shaped by its encounter with the people I don't meet physically. And this is the other conception of democracy, in which popular movements, social movements, politics, and freedom of the press is the mechanism whereby not only I can understand the other, but also my self-understanding can only be available to me. I can only be what I would like to be through this engagement, which needs this freedom. And I think, just to report, I think there was, I think Scandinavia was very happy 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that there was a real moment when the movements that brought sovereignty to our countries, there were real popular movements with people engaged who fighting in solidarity and also dialoguing through the spaces created by the press, by the media. And this shaped our self-understanding, our societies in a big way. And we still live with that. We have institutionalized strong press freedom. We have strong institutional safeguards for trade union activities, for non-governmental organizations. So all this is a long history, and we are lucky still to be shaped not only by the memory of these moments when we could live as individuals by living in a political society which had a fair degree of democracy. It's under pressure. through commercialization. The new media, I'm sure my friends will tell more about that, is under pressure, but we still have a sense, I think, in Nordic countries of respecting our societies as places where we can shape ourselves as citizens who are shaped by and through the engagement with others through media. It's a very deep thing in our tradition. It's vulnerable. Maybe it's under pressure, but it has been there. And I think there are reasons to say that the Nordic countries, the democracy we had, the prosperity we've had, and the peace we've had, and also the kind of solidarity with the rest of the world we've had, maybe not ideal, but maybe a bit more than some other countries. I think it draws on resources that were created by the popular movements that shaped our countries 100 and 150 years ago. And I would like to share with you the India-Nordic experience, the relation that was there around 1900, but I'll save that to later. But there's the basic perspective that this rich idea of democracy where people are shaped through engagement with others and can only get to themselves through this engagement, and the press is extremely important, therefore, for the moral self-understanding and the growth of each of us individually. So that's what I wanted, the basic perspective I wanted to share, and I'm very happy to hear experts on the press and journalism to address these matters of common concern. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Moring. The context has been set in a manner which is broad, and we can share our own experiences. You also have been writing where you saw that this is not the ideal condition, though Nordic countries may be the top of the ladder, but it's yet not the ideal condition that Professor Moring wants to see it for the minorities, for example, or the kind of three issues that you have flagged off: presidentialization of politics, mediatization of politics. Then there's a third element which I'm forgetting at the moment: personalization of the politics. There are stresses on this context. So I want you to elaborate on the way you see the context in which the press media has been dealing with, and yet retaining a kind of composure that Professor Wahlgren was talking about.
Yes, I'm very happy that Professor Wahlgren started this discussion, and that he started it from this very base, namely the foundation of freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of media in the Nordic countries. They are a little bit different, but they have a common ground. Finland was part of Sweden until 1809, which meant that we actually could found our constitution very much close to the constitutional development in Sweden, which at that time was very active, for example, under the King Gustav III. Much happened after that. Finland was made a Grand Duchy of Russia, and the constitutional development in Finland was frozen down for about 100 years. We could establish a constitution of our own. This constitution is a little bit different than the constitution that during these 100 years had developed in Sweden, where a more liberal constitutional tradition had taken form under the Oscarian rule, and Gunnar Nygren will certainly know more about that than I do. But fundamentally, the basis is exactly the one that Thomas Wahlgren pointed out. It is the basis in political movements, people's movements, the organization of society in ways that can bring forward what one could say the basis for a deliberative democracy. I think what Thomas described in research that I'm involved in now is on the basis of the same philosopher Jürgen Habermas often referred to as a deliberative society. And the idea would be the deliberativeness of society, meaning that people can share and come to common solutions in an orderly way, in a discussion, which means give and take. Now, the problems that you pointed to, Professor, that was really something that remained a little bit from the differences between Finland and Sweden. We had a more authoritarian tradition. We have a tradition of a stronger presidentship. We have a more individualized election system. We have a system of personalization of politics, which is stronger in Finland because of these institutional factors. And we have a tradition of authoritarianism in our administration, our administrative structure, that actually remained a little bit from the old divisions between Finland and Sweden in 1809. I wouldn't exaggerate these things, but they have led to a little bit of difference between Sweden and Finland. And maybe I will now give the floor to Gunnar Nygren and let him continue on this matter, and then maybe come back with more details, because I think it would be better to now have a dialogue on this.
Professor Nygren.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, I would say that the question you put in the beginning of this discussion, how we have been able to defend press freedom, so to be in the top of the ranking for so long time, it's a very good question, because when you are a researcher in Sweden or in Finland or in India, you often focus on your own country and the problems you have in your own country without having this more broad comparison. And I think it's interesting to have this comparison. I think as Professor Moring mentioned, Sweden and Finland was one country for many hundred years until 1809, and our constitution with press freedom that was introduced in 1766 was in fact a result from the work of a priest living in Finland, in the Finnish part of the Swedish state. So we have the same tradition, and the basis in that tradition is that there is freedom of print and no censorship. That is one important principle that has been in place since 1766. No censorship, and also freedom of access to public documents. So that has been a very strong tradition. But then, as Professor Wallgren mentioned, also we had during the 19th century in Sweden and in Finland very strong popular movements that has been supporting this press freedom. I mean, press freedom is not given once for all. Press freedom, you have to defend it. You have to struggle for it all the time, because there are always interests in society, political interests from power in different places in society to decrease press freedom in different ways. So there has to be a kind of strong defense for press freedom. And the defense for press freedom has been in Sweden very much based on the popular movements in political parties, in labor movement, in peasants movement, in a movement for not drinking alcohol, in movement for Christianity to have a sort of free Christianity, not connected to state church. So it's very broad popular movements have supported press freedom. So that I would say is one important explanation to your question. Then, of course, press freedom has not always been on top. It has been down and go up and down, depending on the political circumstances. But still, there is a broad kind of broad unity around the principles of press freedom. And one example of this is that for example, we have a system of media subsidies in Sweden. Press subsidies, where newspapers and also online news sites can apply for support from the state, and this support is not distributed according to political political direction, but you can have it either if you are what political direction you have. So I'm a member of this state board that decides about the press subsidies, and also a number of politicians, and I mean we have right-wing politicians supporting left-wing newspapers and the opposite. So the most important thing is to have a diversity, to have many newspapers, and the state should not say anything about the content. State should only support diversity.
Thank you, Mr. Nygren. The context that you set so well, all three of you, reminds me, as well as must be reminding all of our listeners and the participants, that India, when it attained freedom in 1947, actually had undergone 150 years old and a century and a half old struggle for civil liberty, for press freedom. And the funny part was that almost every leader of that movement of a century, every leader of any size, from a village, or a big village, or a small town, used to be an editor of his own newspaper or news magazine. So Indian freedom movement was in some sense embedded into the demand for press freedom from the British state. And this is interesting again, that Britain itself was undergoing democratic changes, Chartist movements, and everything was happening in Britain. So India being a colony and yet being an experimental ground for many of those freedom. So therefore the students who would go to Britain, they will come back learning the same rights and then demand the same rights here. So it is, you're absolutely right in that, all three of you, to make this point, that there is a local context embedded in the global situation of freedom. So therefore we had a huge context, and maybe that context is what pulled us for the last 70 years. And people find at the moment that that context in some sense is no longer there, or the context is appropriated by some other kind of context, or that context needs a revisit. So all these things are happening at the moment. India, as Press Freedom, the association which present the report, the Press Across Border, present 3-4 categories: political, social, security of journalists, and all these. But to us, those who have gone deeper, they understand that the struggle for freedom of the press, of the media, is also intimately related with the quest for freedom in other domains of life. As a professor, am I helped? I'm free. Am I self-censoring myself? Am I free to think of? Is the political arena allowing deliberative democracy to survive, or deliberations to take place, or imagine a new possibilities? So all these things, political domain, social domain, cultural domain, are undergoing in tremendous transitions in India. And that the pressure is felt firsthand by the media. And this pressure that is bringing out all kind of things. And this is not just in India. I was reading, a friend of mine just sent me his book, Hungary. It's called Hungary, the State of Exception. So what is happening in Hungary? What is happening in many other countries? So therefore, it is in this context, what is your impression of those who are familiar with India? Because two of you who work on press, actually have worked in the other countries also. We have a huge collaborative project in Poland, Russia, Russian journalism. What do you think are the common, I won't say dangers, common stresses, common threats to all the countries, including Finland, though Finland is at the top at the moment, but yet those, as is rightly said, unless we keep struggling, keep fighting, we may not be actually retaining those freedom that we have today. So therefore, what are the common dangers or threats or stresses on media freedom that you see in other parts of the country that you studied or you are familiar with, so that we can think of where are those threats coming from? Technology is one. Fake news, for example, is a common threat to everyone. It generates from somewhere or the other, but it's a big thing for us. So we don't know where is the news is fake or not fake, and so that's we will discuss it later. But common threats, please, Mr. Newton, please.
I would like to connect to your what you said last, Harry, about fake news. Of course, the notion of fake news is very much discussed, but I would say that the discussion about fake news is in itself a threat to press freedom, because there is in many countries
Exactly.
The people in power, they label all kind of news that are against their own interests as fake news. For example, I mean, in Russia, in China, in countries like Singapore or any kind of authoritarian country, the rulers, they news they don't like, they label them as fake, and then you try to suppress these kind of news. So that is a discussion about fake news has in itself been a threat to freedom of expression. I don't know if the other professors agree with me, but
this is of course a core matter, I think, in today's world that we are discussing now, and it's good that we come to this. Maybe we come to it a little bit early in our discussion, because this is where we are now and this is where we are going, and there's been a path to this point. The path includes an enormous change of the conditions of media business. Since about 2005-2010, big conglomerates, international conglomerates, I'm referring to Facebook, I'm referring to Amazon, I'm referring to various other YouTube, etc., etc., and also social media, new social media systems like TikTok and others. They have come into the world, and the biggest ones have taken a very strong proportion of the advertising market. Now, in the Nordic countries, for example, the press is basically financed through revenues from subscribers and from advertising. In Sweden, you have a press subsidy system. In Finland, we do not have this anymore. It was actually taken down in the first years of this millennium, and only some minority media get a very minor economic support anymore. So the press has to survive on commercial grounds. The public service radio and television, which developed very much as national communication channels through the idea of civilization, carrying culture, education, etc., later on became, one could say, also news media, leading news media, and have today an important role also in the world of putting things on internet, making cultural and news items available on internet. And the Finnish press has this as well. But there are competitors who come from abroad. And today, some media experts in Finland, for example, say that the Finnish media actually do not so much compete between themselves. They compete with the big conglomerates who carry education, who carry sports, who carry also pornography, who carry various kinds of contents that are taking both time from the audience and advertising revenues that were earlier feeding into the press. So this could be kind of a background to the development that we see, and the development that you, Professor Batavial, pointed to. Now, when we then look at what is the result, well, first of all, the press, in a way, and we see this now with the Ukrainian war, in the Russian attack and war in Ukraine, that the traditional media sector, including radio, TV, and the press, have regained much of its importance and much of its credibility in a time when you have systematic spread on a global base from big states who carry out false information, fake information, who try to influence actively citizens in other states. And this is not anymore a question from some blogger or some Facebook enthusiast. It's a question of state-oriented and state-managed systematic disinformation. So in this way, traditional national media sources and some international media sources, I'm referring to BBC. BBC might not have the best reputation in India, but in the European countries, it's still felt as one of the main media sources that you can really find credible in this situation. These regain a certain credibility, and I would claim, Gunnar, you may correct me if I'm wrong, but I would claim that already the COVID crisis that we had with health issues were giving a little bit of a push forward for traditional media, who have now, in a way, regained strength again. This would be the optimistic view. We can come back to the pessimistic view in a while.
Thank you. So, Wahlgren, you have been saying that there is a problem with the larger context of European Union, where the new economy, the economy that they're indicating to, is actually embedded in. So in that context, and today what is happening in that part of your part of Europe, how do you see this discussion that is going on?
Well, I'll first let me say that I'm happy to hear this thesis by Tom Mooring on the development of the last 2-3 years. I think that's an interesting proposal, and I will consider. The overall picture of the last decades we have had in Europe is that we're going through a kind of an experiment where we had a time in the 20th century, maybe especially in Nordic countries, but I think also in other countries in Western Europe, when there was a sense that we had we were building public spaces which were common and rather democratic, which gave voice, thanks also to state subsidies to various outlets, gave voice to a large variety of actors, and we could meet in a common public space. Now, there's a lot of pressures on that, and the European Union, which has become a more dominant political entity in our lives, which has taken over a lot of those state power functions which used to reside with the nation states. From the Habermas, from the perspective of deliberative democracy, there's two challenges. which are difficult to meet. One is that we haven't, the multilingual space in the European Union is new to us compared with the nation states that dominated European politics in the 20th century. And it has not been easy to create, given the powers that are concentrated in Brussels, and you have that in Delhi, in India, the powers, we haven't really built the mechanisms to integrate the different national public domains, the public spaces, the democratic discussions of the various member countries of Europe haven't really been able to integrate and meet in Brussels in the same way. And therefore, there's been a shift in power from the movements and parties as democratic actors to commercial actors already before social media came. Now, as Professor Moring pointed out, the second challenge comes from the rise of social media, which are commercial, almost with almost a monopoly on certain kinds of media flows, and also dominant news flows. So when they take the money from the advertisement, the traditional media, which have a larger diversity, are at risk of losing their foothold as shaping the opinions and shaping the understanding of people. So we have that. What we see happening is we see fragmentation. We see the bubbles, people who isolate themselves through the social media and don't reach the common ground, don't deliberate with people who are not like themselves. So there's these two pressures. One is that we haven't had the structures for post-national public space in Europe. And now we have the commercialization and the fragmentation of the public space. And I think we can see empirically in the short run, things don't look very good. We have polarization, we have the rise of populist movements. So those who have come from the sort of the center-left traditions feel that we are France, Italy, the movements and the democratic forces that shaped our societies have lost ground a lot, and we have increasing emotionalization of politics. So that has happened. Now, you may say, well, we are fighting back, and I think, thank you, Gunnar Nygren, and I think state subsidies, I think state, in that sense, I'm a good Nordic social democrat, that I think the state must take a greater responsibility for guaranteeing diversity and for putting restrictions on the negative effects of commercialization that were pointed out by the two earlier speakers. So we have these pressures on us, but maybe I'm glad to hear that maybe the last two, 3 years have given back credibility to the traditional media, which were more encompassing, which provided a space where people from different strands of our society could meet and deliberate together. So I'm glad to hear that observation, and I'm keen to see how we can strengthen that trend in our societies in these difficult times.
I just want to clarify also what I meant by this, what I said about fake news. Of course, there are disinformation, as Professor Moring mentioned. There are strong states like Russia that uses the disinformation and fake news as a mean to influence opinions in other countries. And I have studied that myself in the conflict in Ukraine, where it's very clear that of course, information, as always, propaganda is used in conflicts and wars to demonize the enemy and to give strength for their own. But if we talk about threats to freedom of expression and freedom of press, I think that there is a kind of double threat, because as both Professor Moring and Valger mentioned, we have these strong, big global companies like Facebook and Google, and that are taking very much of the economic resources, and this put a very strong commercial pressure on traditional mainstream media. They have to cut down and have less resources. The media companies becomes much more vulnerable, and at the same time we have a strong political will in many countries to use media for political purposes, like in Russia, for example, but also in countries like Poland and Hungary. We have very strong political forces that want to use media in their own political purposes. So if we have, on the one hand, a weaker commercial base and a stronger political pressure, that is not good for freedom of press. So I see for Europe and also for Sweden that this is a threat for the coming years.
Thank you. And with this, let me introduce what I thought about happening in India, so that I can elicit the kind of comparative understanding that we have. What is happening, apart from the large stresses, that large tension, large churning that is happening in Indian society over the last decade or so, maybe after the new economy, it opened up, and the entire developmental process brought new classes to the urban milieu, the rural milieu, what we have in India, the caste assertions, identity assertions, everything was coming together, and comes this huge corporations, couple of corporations, which now needed the state to be in their side rather than the kind of socialist, left liberal, as you centrist kind of state. So what we are witnessing in India is two changes of two sides. One is the change in the definition of character of the state itself. And on the other, in order to change itself, it wants to now change the definition of people too. The people are now, for example, in recent advertisement, I was reading a receipt that I got from an agency. It tells me not as a citizen, not my name. It says, what is the name of the beneficiary? So we are increasingly becoming beneficiary. We have a beautiful name for it called Labharthi. I've got benefit from the state. So though there was welfare state earlier, but the welfare state did not define the citizen as beneficiary. It called them citizen, and therefore citizens' right. So what we are having over the last, that because of the transitions happening, churning happening, and also happening together with a larger global milieu, that state wants to be different. And one way it can be different is it's trying to be ideological state, that it has its ideology and nothing else matters. Similarly, people are trying to be given a new definition. It is in this too that media is squeezed in. And then comes the big corporation, because it takes sides of the state, and then it tries to define the people. And therefore, the definitions that Press Freedom Index has talked about, the life threat to journalists, comes from not only the state, generally, as you have seen in the struggle for press freedom in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, and North America, in India, had been defined generally vis-a-vis the state, that state cannot intern you. But here, not just the state is trying to define you, but also there's a citizenry which is trying to define themselves anew. So therefore, we are having this twin context of state and people, and the larger economy, where a couple of corporations wants to control. I was reading today's newspaper. I thought I'll keep the clipping for you. There's a huge merger happening, huge investment happening, where Rupert Murdoch's son comes into India and having a different kind of arrangement. And the new arrangement, which is just beginning, is into where the entertainment media is now getting into education. So what we are going to see very soon is what you have already mentioned, is about the merger of not just politics and media, but culture, politics, and media through education. So it is the larger context in which I pose a question to all three of you. how did the popular movement shape itself for the last, say, decade or so, in particularly after 2007-8 financial crisis in Finland? How people define themselves in this context of changes, because that is where in India the crisis is. People are not able to define, the popular movements are not able to define as to what kind of direction they have to go, and the media therefore is in a limbo.
Can I start with some reflections, because of course exactly the same development, maybe not in the same way, but the same larger picture is visible also in our very small countries. If you take Finland, with a population which is smaller than most Indian cities, we have 5.3 or 5.4 million people in our country.
Not laughing.
So this has been a very homogeneous country. Also, there's been a tendency to relate to the nation state and consider that as homogeneous, much more so than in Sweden, which has been a more open society and has had a much larger level of migration. In Finland, I think the number of migrants, Thomas may know better, but I think it's not even beyond 10% yet. And this means that Finland is a very homogeneous country still. Now, what happens in the development that you describe? We can't talk about one tendency. We must talk about several tendencies. Part of people react in a way that they want to isolate. Nationalism becomes stronger. You get a stronger right-wing, or not even maybe right-wing, but nationalist, conservative, culturally conservative movement, which is also socially kind of leaning a little bit to the left, because these are often not so very well earning people, maybe poor people. So you have this kind of new movement, conservative movement, who is very nationalistic. And this you see not only, of course, in Finland, you see it in, well, the last election in presidential election in France was a case of point, where you see how strong that movement can be. And then on the other hand, you have people who are oriented in a totally different way. And the activists on these two sides, to say, they would not maybe count for a very large part of the population. Those in the middle who basically live a life not really different from before and do not feel these things so very strongly. They are still a clear majority. That was also what saved France, I think, from right-wing populism this time. But these activist parts are very active on social media and on free media, and they make their way also through blunt threats. The freedom of media in Finland has been hurt during recent years through blunt attacks, also threats to physically attack journalists. That hasn't happened much before. I was a journalist for a long time. Sometimes I met somebody who thought that I've written something that wasn't in his or her taste, and in a restaurant said that I'll give you a bump on the nose if I meet you on the street one dark night. Well, I wasn't very afraid. But today, this is getting new forms and becoming more aggressive and more serious in Finland today, and also I think in Sweden and in other European countries. So this would be the negative side. I said I'd come back to the negative side, and Thomas already pointed a little bit towards where the negative forces have been and how they have been strengthening. This comes directly into journalists' possibility to maintain their trade freely and not under threat. This is not a threat from the state. This is a threat from social movements that are radical.
Mr. Nygren?
So one thing we have not mentioned still in this discussion is the fragmentation of the media system. I mean, both Sweden and Finland was very homogeneous countries with very homogeneous media systems also. Everybody looked on the same TV programs, read the same newspapers. There was a very, the public space was very hold together. So it's like a meeting place where you had the same references. But what has happened the last 20 years is that we have an increased fragmentation in the media system with many TV channels on the net. We have social media, we have this phenomena discussed as filter bubbles. If it how strong it is, we can discuss, but there is a fragmentation that people are more relying on media that confirms their own opinions in beforehand. So there is less places where you can meet people with other opinions and get an understanding of that people can see the reality from different points of view. So and I think this is an important thing behind what Professor Moring said about the threats against journalists. That when the polarization is growing and people become isolated from other people with different political standpoints, that there is also more of a aggressiveness and more of a conflict. And that is in some way a threat against this Nordic system that has been very, well, we used to say in research, a democratic cooperative system based on compromise and the discussion. Now it's more polarized, and that is not good for press freedom in the long run.
You hit it on up, because in India, the polity so far had been defined in terms of the process of consensus building. And that has been targeted from all kinds of sections, because nowhere in the social processes, in the religious matters, in the matters of culture, the idea of consensus has been given away in some sense, or rather attacked. It is therefore coming to the same question that Professor, or rather context in which Professor Wahlgren contextualized our discussion today, that they have in the Finland, the democracy, the media, the freedom that we enjoy had come through two processes, two ideas of democracy. One was the Hobbesian ideas and the kind of liberalism emerged from that, and the second is the kind of idea that we have post-Socratic ideas of enlightenment and then the deliberative democracy. Now, both are in some sense under threat in many parts, including India. So therefore, there is no, and there's no light in the sense that there's no sentinel, so to say. When Nelson Mandela was there, we saw that he was the sentinel in some sense. There is no world statesman today. There's no watchtower. It is in this context that we in India, for example, those who want to read good newspaper, not fake news, those who believe in knowledge society, not in empty knowledge, prejudices being palleted as opinions, we look towards this press reports and Finland as. And believe me, yesterday's newspaper carried a news item that most of the schools, but unfortunately the private school where elite children go, they are looking towards Finland to collaborate with the Finnish school to become more creative. It is in this sense that I would ask a very, very pointed question as to what is the sentinel, or a kind of, I won't say sentinel, what is the kind of ideal that a journalist, a young journalist who goes to a new office, starts writing his columns or byline, today look towards in Finland, for example? What is he defending? what is it defending against? What is it defending actually for, or what is it defending? A young journalist, maybe in TV journalist or a newspaper journalist, what is it? What she thinks of?
I have been teaching the first course for newcomers into my journalism class for about 20 years. I've always put the same question you put now to them. Why do you want to be a journalist? And I could say, not to make this a very long answer, I could say that the division is into two groups, and they are basically almost equally big. The first group wants to be a writer, actually. I want to write. I want to get a name as a writer. I want to have a journalism education in order to, in a way, produce myself as an intellectual and a public person. The other group is socially oriented. I want to better society. I want to influence. I want to make good to people by increasing their knowledge and by doing almost like Tintin, the famous French comic figure, strip figure, be the hero of society who brings out rottenness and false deeds by politicians, etc., etc., etc. So you have these two basic sentiments, and I think that in a way they are not mutually exclusive. They can be combined in one and the same person, but these responses are relatively distinct. So apparently in my students, half of the group is more dominated by the social, one would say, ambition to better society, and the other is more like motivated by being an intellectual, public intellectual that is influences through writing or movies, videos, etc. This would be a short answer.
This is Professor Wahlgren.
Yes, I'd like to come back to the question of schools and schools in Finland, in India, and link that to what I see as the biggest challenge to our also the socially conscientious young journalists. Let me just have this kind of dramatic worry that one thing which we see, if we look at the reactions in Western Europe to the war in Ukraine and compare that with the reactions to the war in Yemen, I want to present to you this grim diagnosis that we see an enormous gap between the amount of compassion and solidarity Western Europeans, including Finnish and Swedish, can mobilize for the people who suffer in Ukraine, as compared with what we are able to mobilize in our reactions to the people in Yemen. We have these terrible wars, and the way our relation, the mediated relation to the world, is created, not only young people, but large sections of our population find it very hard to feel compassion with the victims of the war in Yemen, and quite easy to identify with and feel compassion with the victims of the war in the Ukraine. That's an enormous failure of our public debate. It's an enormous failure of how we have been able to construct those relations to the others, those we can't know. I mean, the heart of the Socratic or the deliberative democratic ideal is that all the people we are materially related to should also be related to in our imagination, in our ideals. And that is failing us. We speak about the right-wing populism in Western Europe, but when you look at Western Europe from the perspective of the rafts with refugees or people trying to come from Africa to Finland, the difference between the liberal and the right-wing populists is quite small. When you look at Western Europe from the perspective of Yemen, the difference between the right-wing populist and the green and red and liberal, social liberal idealist in Finland and Sweden is rather small. And I think that somehow is based on a failure in our societies to create that kind of relation to the children in India and the children in Yemen and the children in Africa and other continents that would give us a sense of a deep sense of responsibility of sharing this planet with people from other continents. We have a sense we share this planet with the people in Ukraine, but we don't have that sense deep in us for many others who are further away and not so very far away. Even Syria is difficult for Finnish people to relate to. And I think that shows that also we don't need only media, we need those first-hand encounters. We need the children in India and in Finland who know each other and who shape these friendships. And that has been difficult. And I think maybe, well, I'm a Gandhian in that sense, that I think what we see also is the too much complexity. There's a limit to how much complexity, how much distance we can travel only by media. We need also the personal encounters, and maybe life has to be limited, localized, so that the material and the ideal dimensions of life would be in better balance than they are now. Now it seems the material flows are so global, but the ideal flows, the flows of idea, the meetings between people are less globalized, and that creates a difficulty for us to grow to those persons we would like to be. I think this goes deeper than only press freedom and media, but also maybe presents a challenge for all of us who also think that we need press freedom, but not only that, but also the meeting between people who care for each other in order to construct ourselves as the people we would like to be. So this was a big topic, but I wanted to present the perspective of a Western European who suffers from not from the very good reactions we see to the war in Ukraine, but suffers from seeing the incapacity we're experiencing in mobilizing the same kind of strong political reaction to other calamities of our times. So that is one.
Glad you pointed this out. The limiting the forces that limits us, and in that sense, I think the national movement that India had, the leadership, the intellectuals, the literature, the poets, authors, all of them had come in the early 20th century till 1950s, 60s. The media was part of it, and what media, press, writings, novels, poetry, everything did was to make people not only global citizen in the truest sense of the term, also sensitive, compassionate, sensitive to their own society. That's why Gandhi would first ameliorate the untouchability question, address it. He resigns from Congress, 2 years, devotes himself to a social question. I don't think any politician today would resign from a party and go to address a social question. Leadership will go, but that's the other way around. So therefore, we have a context in which we made our society sensitive. In India, I would see other societies too. Now suddenly we realize that not only the media is fragmented, the society is fragmented. The compassion that you show for one, you limit for the other. So therefore, your compassionate is also compartmentalized. So and it's not happening at a Finnish level or a national level or a global level. It's happening in a city. That's why this idea of global assemblages I like so much. Saskia Sasan's idea that a part of Delhi where I live is my children are so attuned to be part of New York or Helsinki or any part. They absolutely no problem. But they cannot, and they do not have the energy and resources to be part of the same city in some part where maybe the poor lives or the minority ghettos are there or some other ghettos are coming up. So therefore, we are fragmenting ourselves within. So forces which tries to unite, not necessarily in a compassionate way, but very violent way. So they will unite with a religion or something else or some governance issues. So therefore, what media finds therefore face to face is with a system which is compartmentalized, fragmentalized, and therefore it itself is confused as to which section to address. And it is this juncture. I have six or seven PhD students at this moment working on different fragmentization of media, and they all come back to me and they say, sir, ultimately it is one company which tells them which segment to address to, and the company has no passion, no compassion. So therefore, we are in some sense trying to recover compassion, recover citizenship, recover deliberation, democracy, enlightenment, knowledge, and at the same time, the journalist who goes in order with an ideal to become a journalist in order to change the society comes back with a pay package, which very soon changes him and makes him one part of that compartmentalized society. So therefore, so this is a kind of quagmire in which media lives today in India, where it is not able to feel himself part of any large mission at the moment where it was earlier. Therefore, Gandhi was a great journalist, Nehru was a great journalist, everyone was a journalist. Today, you can't point out a great journalist who's leader. So with these words, gentlemen, I must thank you enormously and now address let us see how the participants wants to ask their pointed question to all of you. Vijay Pratap ji, I want to open it for the questions.
पहले आनंद जी अगर कुछ कमेंट करना चाहें, उसके बाद ओपन कर दें। प्रोफेसर आनंद कुमार।
I'm very happy that my friend Rakesh Bhattabyal and Vijay Pratap have facilitated this transnational and transcontinental conversation about media and democracy. As it is, we are available with the three very concerned minds. It will be not very fair for me to dig into their time. Yes, it will be interesting to ask them how they are viewing the Indian democratic scenario from that distance, because they have been knowing India in one way or the other. I remember Professor Walgreen participating in World Social Forum and other colleagues also, because we are as if trapped in a ditch. We don't see much positive around us in terms of future of democracy or partnership between the project of democracy and project of democratic nation building through media. So how do you see us from that distance? And what do you feel about our responses? Are we very paranoid or are we underestimating the crisis? How do you locate us? What is your grade for us? Thank you.
Maybe Professor Walgren would be the best one to respond to questions that relate to the actual situation in India. But I understand that Professor Kumar's question related to how we view it from distance. And that, of course, earns an answer also from me, who does not know very much about the answer, the question. But what I would point to is that the huge diversity that exists in India is indeed more than a challenge. It's really also a problem, but it also is something that is potentially very rich. And those people in the media sector I've been talking with on these matters have pointed exactly to how much more diverse India is in terms of languages, cultures, religions than the entire Europe. So to come with an advice from a small country up north would not be wise. Let me point to one technical fact that I think is very, very interesting, and that we see around the world in regions that are impoverished, that are really poor. We see a jump from a system where first there actually was very little communication with the outside world at all. Then the radio came in and formed kind of a way to understand a broader society. Somewhere in the 1920s, 1930s, in some places only in 1940s or later. But anyway, the radio became the big thing. The television in the poorest areas maybe came in, but not even that came in. And now in these areas, in many of these areas, you jump directly onto internet. And this is an enormous jump, because suddenly an entire world opens up that was closed or very limited before. And I'm very, very curious about how this will affect countries that have such areas that have been isolated and poor. And I'm not referring now to that India would be poor. India is a very, very rich country with very, very rich cities, etc., etc. But it's so diverse. You have so much differences there.
So Algren, you want to come on?
Well, thank you, Anand Kumar. Good to hear your voice after many years. I don't know much, but I have this observation I want to share. I've been saddened by what I've seen as a continuation in India of the dominance of what already Gandhi fought 120 years back, now dominance of the aspiration to be to imitate what is seen as a success of the Western world. I see the rise of BJP and Modi as being sort of based on the promise of India as sort of reaching modern consumerism, Westernization, that kind of thing, a kind of a future for India that would be an imitation of something that has happened elsewhere. So, and I see, I mean, that is the dominant paradigm, of course, in all countries now. The idea of development, which my friends in India have been so good at criticizing at CSBS. My friends are Ashish Nandi and Rajni Kothari and others. So I report that as a sense that the dominance of the imitation model of development still seems to be there. I also want to report that I still try to follow a little bit the social movement struggles, and again there I think struggles like Kishan Andolan in India this winter are struggles which give inspiration and hope to people like me in other parts of the world. So we have this mixed picture. We see, like in all countries, we see a dominance of something which I think may be due to ecological reasons already, maybe also other reasons, fatal for the future of humanity. We see dominance of that, but also see a strong presence still in India of the vibrant democratic life that comes from below and has aspirations, cultural images which are not drawn, at least not so much, from the Western Empire. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Nygren, want to come on this?
Yeah, I would like to add, I don't know so much about India, but when I look on comparative research in journalism, comparative between different continents, different countries, different kind of media, different kind of social systems, and so one common thread, one common thing is that the importance of professionalization of journalism. I mean, professionalization is extremely important for the degree of press freedom. If you get a strong journalistic profession with people with education, I mean, I agree with Professor Moring. When the newcomers come, they want to be writers, so they want to change the world. But what the education does is to give this a strong professional commitment, to strong professional values, strong professional knowledge in how to do journalism. And if you have a strong profession, this profession is a kind of guards for press freedom and guards for the public space to be democratic and to have different kinds of opinions and discussion. So professionalization of journalism is, I think, extremely important when you look on press freedom, how to preserve and increase press freedom.
Can I add, Gunnar, say some words about the importance of the ethics, the media ethics system, because that connects exactly to what you said. Both Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland have a strong fundament in journalism ethics that is generally an accepted set of rules of conduct that is shared by what one could call serious media. Could you comment a little bit more on that?
Yeah, if I can continue on that, that as I mentioned before, there is a strong, the media system in the Nordic countries are corporatist in that way that there is both a strong professionalism in journalism, strong independence, but also a strong sense of social responsibility. That journalists have a responsibility towards society, and to fulfill this, there is in Sweden and also in other Nordic countries a system of ethical self-regulation. And the paradox is that we have a very liberal constitution when it comes to freedom of print. You can print almost everything. It's very difficult to put a journalist in jail because what he or she wrote or said. It happens never in Sweden. But there is at the same time a strong self-regulation. You could call it self-censorship, but so kind of journalists commit themselves to follow the ethical rules of how to do journalism without making harm to people. We taking responsibility for the consequences of what they are doing. So I think that this is only possible if you have a strong strong professionalization, a strong group of journalists that are both free but they decide to follow some ethical rules. So that is, I mean, for example, in Sweden, in the 1960s, the government wanted to study if it was possible to make press freedom a little bit less free, because they were not satisfied with how the newspaper worked. But to avoid that, the newspapers and the journalists union and all actors came together in this self-regulation. So instead of laws, we have self-regulation. And I think that is much better for press freedom.
Sudhirji.
I have a very small, humble submission to the experts who are present here. I believe that the media, as it was known and as it was supposed to be as a tool for the activist and the information giver, that has been taken over by the neoliberals completely. And that will not be reversible so easily. So in my humble opinion, it may be worth considering on how we can rebuild the real media at the grassroots level and connect all the grassroots level such medias among themselves using the social media that exists today, and thus create a people-to-people connection that somebody spoke very well, which is needed so that people in one country can feel more closer to another one which is far away and all that. That's all that I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Fardun, you want to ask a question?
So yeah, I put it in the chat also. It's about journalist Gauri Lankar being assassinated blatantly by the present government, and Rana Ayub being threatened so much so that she was not allowed to leave the country and taken to the court because of being what they called anti the present government. So it's escalating in our country to quite a lethal rate. So what are your thoughts on that, and how can we tackle that at a more immediate way, you know, because I'm sure more and more journalists are going to be played safer and sorrier than with the recent things, yeah? So since we have such brilliant minds here, I'd like to know what we could do to support people like Rana Ayub and other journalists who want to speak up and have the guts to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll leave it to make it a general question about the threat to journalists. And this is from a context in India, but there is a general question about particularly investigating journalists. As you could make out, a couple of them were killed in Malta, if I remember. Many of them were, in the Panama and other scam cases. So, do you have any of these things in your? Because Finland is otherwise not a dangerous country for journalists in this sense, that's why they're at the top. But there may be other countries like what we are witnessing in many parts of our country, where not just the state, but even civil society which is in an uncivil way comes to threaten you. So in this threatful situation, Fardun was asking for a recipe, how to restore our confidence in the life and security of media person. Anyone who want to say anything on this? Because we have already addressed this. Vijayji, you want to say something on this?
I would say that the most important thing, I think, is to strengthen the public opinion around these cases, because journalism is not important only for journalists. Journalism is important for the whole society. Journalism is not for a small thing, for a professional group. It is for all society. It's for people need journalism, and then we have to show people that you have to defend the journalist, and for example, to give more. To demand from the police, for example, to work with these cases.
Thank you. Anyone?
I think that what Gunnar Nygren just said is maybe the basic possibility there is, both in response to the question posed by Faridon and the earlier question by Mr. Zudir. I think the common ground for serious media would be the professionalization and the possibility to attach people to a common ethical code, and then of course to found this in strong legislation in favor of freedom of expression, freedom of the media, and non-interference from the political side in the freedom of the press. I must admit that the situation in Finland is not all that excellent today. Finland fell, if you look carefully at the freedom of express index, it fell from position number 2 to position number 5 this year. This is not a dramatic change. We are still on the top. But one reason was that 3 journalists have been called into court for writing about security-oriented matters that the army considers secret. They did it on official public documents, They did not steal any documents or publish anything that was officially declared as state secrets. They worked on public documents, and they are still now called into court. That wasn't well taken by those who make the freedom of the press index. I've been in that group who has been giving ratings to Finnish situation for many years. I'm not there anymore, but I was there earlier, and Finland always was very clean on this issue, but not today. Today something's happened, and security issues come up also here in this very small and homogeneous part of, has to do possibly with what changes we see around us, what threats we feel from Russia. That might be part of the story, but there is always a fight for freedom of the press. There is always a collective aspect to it, that the press as a whole has to stand up for certain values, and the state has to accept these values and should put it in legislation. I put on the chat, I put the Finnish constitutional paragraph on freedom of expression, and I put the special media law on freedom of expression in the media, and I've also the ethical code of Finland. I don't know if Gunnar could do the same at some point, or send it to Professor Batabial in order for you to get access to these documents, because they are important.
Very important. Today, while we were discussing this, the Supreme Court of India, which is the Supreme Federal Court also, has been listening to the case on the constitutionality and otherwise of Article 124A, which talks about the sedition law. Indian Penal Code, according to that, is anything that state thinks is seditious, it can be seditious. And many of the journalists, protesters, and all are actually booked under this law. Very interestingly, as a historian, when I was writing about this law, from 1890s, the public figures in India, journalists, legislators, they were fighting against this section, against the British rule. And almost unanimous fight against Muslim League, Congress, the bitter enemies of public forum, but on this law, they were all together. Similarly, the British loyal, the upper class, the elite of Indian section at that point of time, the economic elite was part of the British system. Even they came in to support abrogation of this law in 1919, 1928, so much so that in the Constituent Assembly, when the Constitution was drafted, the debate, a huge amount of debate around this law, and the fundamental rights were guaranteed in order to protect citizens from this. Suddenly we see that the kind of movement that should have come up on across party line, across political ideologies, to abrogate this law, because ultimately it is not just for the journalists, it is for everyone. Somewhere the public space has shrunk in this sense, so far as the protesting against laws which allows freedom. Now, from this question, therefore, this context, therefore, I want to address a very interesting issue that Professor Nygren pointed out, the professionalization and the ethical code. Ethics is so important, but media ethics, can we divorce it from the larger public ethics that we learn from family, learn from schools, learn in the institutions, and then we apply in our professional life as a media? So where do we think, when we can do introspection about ourselves, what is happening in the larger domain, the public ethics that we talk about? I started teaching a course on suddenly ethics for the PhD scholars. Now, new circular has come that we have to teach PhD scholar to be ethical about their thesis writing. Now, this has come as a legislation, a circular, but it was earlier thought to be natural that a PhD scholar has to be ethical in writing this thesis. So what I'm using this example to suggest that something must be happening across the stream till one reaches to the state of being a journalist, where he or she starts lacking ethics. The question is, do school matter? If Finland has done tremendously in schooling, do school matter to media, or professionalization of media, or professional media writer, editor? That schooling matters? This is a question to all of you, but anyone wishes to answer this. This is a reflective question, but it's very important because our Abhishek asked.
So first of all, I would really like to thank the organizing committee for organizing such a fruitful discussion and providing us with such insights of the scholarly views from these scholars. My first and foremost question, sir, in today's discussion is that is free and fair media a distant dream in the contemporary reality, since the ills of the politics have tend to dominate the fairness of media? And if it is so, then how can the media freedom could be ensured in the 21st century global community? So this is my first question.
Okay, Mayank.
So my question follows, we were talking about the sedition law. And there are a lot of fellow journalists. So I'm also working as executive editor of a, you can call it parallel media. And we have been fighting against this regime, or what you can call the anti-democracy kind of regime this last 8 years. I just want to know that there is an ambiguity in a law or the Constitution of India, where we state the fundamental right of freedom to speech, and we add a clause, the freedom of speech with reasonable restrictions. And there have been no specific or specified reasonable restrictions. And taking the advantage of that ambiguous clause, reasonable restrictions. So who would decide that? Either the court and initially the police would decide that what you have violated, because there are no specified reasonable restrictions. I would want to know that, if we talk of US, the First Amendment talks about it, and it grants the absolute freedom of speech. In your countries, and or in Europe, or across the Scandinavian countries, what kind of laws do you have about the freedom of speech? If there are any, do they bother or affect or hinder the process of a free press? And what do you think about that this kind of law or fundamental rights being granted in a way where there are restrictions? Now, there is a counter argument that if there are no restrictions, anyone can say anything. But the truth is that the people or the press or the organizations which are supported by the right-wing extremists in India, which are in the regime right now, they are saying anything. And because the police and the system has to decide that whether or not the reasonable restriction thing is violated, so they can always speak anything what they want. But when you speak the same thing, or you are, as if I say in the language of Chomsky, manufacturing consent instead of manufacturing dissent, the government, pro-government, or the pro-corporate media, or the corporate-owned media has been manufacturing consent. So what do you think about these laws? And do you have such kind of laws in your country? And is the press there also working in spite of or despite of these laws there? So this is what I wanted to ask, and I wanted to make a few comments about this, because this is a really worrisome position, and because of these laws or these restrictions, we are facing a lot of things.
Thank you, man. Professor Nygren, if you want to come on this.
To make it simple, in Sweden, the freedom of press constitution has a list of things that is not allowed to print. It is, for example, to racism, to have very, very racist accusations and that kind of things, and to libel against specific persons. That's not. But the basic principle is in Sweden that you don't have any censorship, and if anybody is going to be fined or jailed for anything, it is after it is printed. And so nothing can be prohibited in beforehand, but only afterwards it can be a trial, and the responsible editor can be fined or jailed. But it is very seldom that happens, because it's also what is allowed to be said. It's a jury of ordinary people who see this in relation to the need for debate on these areas. So it's very seldom that it's a couple of cases a year. I don't know. I suppose it's the same in Finland, but
Mr. Morin,
basically, one could say like this: freedom of expression is a freedom for everybody. It's not for journalists only. And I think that Professor Vatabial already said this earlier in our discussions, that freedom of expression is a general freedom. It relates to freedom of thought. And when you have freedom of thought, you have to have the freedom to express these thoughts. Now, then comes the rule system on how this is applied in media. Basically, those in Finland, those cases where you can be accused or even sentenced for what you do in media are the same as you could be sentenced if you do it to somebody through any other means. That's libel, that's threats, that's things like that. And that falls actually under other types of legislation. You are not allowed to murder a person. You're not allowed to do violence to a person. And there are other laws that says what you can do to other people. And these are regulated in various laws. But the media of expression, the freedom of expression and freedom of the media legislation should not, to my view, continue very much of these rules. The Council of Europe human rights document from 1950 contains an article, I think it's Article 10 or maybe Article 9 or 11, but anyway, where the common European understanding of what is kind of not acceptable in media, that relates exactly to libel, that relates to explicit sexual content directed at minors. It relates to these kinds of things that can be regulated. It also allows for certain regulation on public television, public radio. And these would be the rule systems that we have. I'm very interested in the perspective brought up by Mr. Mayank. I don't know if I express your name correctly now, but when you said that, if I understood you correctly, there is also a counter communication potential in the new media environment, and this counter communication potential has been used, for example, by opposition movements during wartime. During the Second World War, radio was one movement like that. Today, internet, in many cases, is a way out for views that government does not accept. When you have a government control over media, that doesn't go together with the freedom of the media. And media legislation in the Nordic countries and more largely in Europe is aimed at guaranteeing a difference between the media and the political process, the political power. There are now frustrating contradictions to this. In Hungary, in Poland, some restrictions have been lifted, and the governments have taken control over media in a way that is definitely not according to the common rule system that the European Union accepts. And the European Union has criticized quite strongly because of this, criticized these countries. So this is always a question of maintaining a fight for the freedom of expression, and also to be open to oppositional voices who have to be able to communicate in a way that passes the regulation and the control of political power over media, where such control exists.
Thank you so much for elucidating.
If I can just specify what I was trying to communicate. The laws in India, they do not specify, because they do not specify what are the restrictions. So that makes it easier for the authorities to misuse those laws. So it is just said reasonable restrictions, and we do not know what can be. And it is in the hands of the police or the system to decide what it can be, how it is violated. And that makes it complicated. So either it is specified or it is decided after you do it. Or it is decided on the basis of the basic laws in the country. So racism is a criminal offense. Hatred is a criminal offense. You cannot, prohibit the freedom of press, and you cannot file cases on the ambiguity of the law. That is the thing.
Thank you. AM?
Yes, sir. Sir, my question to you, to all the speakers is, we are locating press freedom in the broader universe of political and in the broader political climate and social climate. Sir, but don't you feel that the very nature of technology itself, like one speaker, Professor Mooring, he mentioned about the radio. Don't you feel that the very nature of the radio actually implies some kind of one-way communication? Isn't press freedom to some extent related to that as well? For example, in India, when we see that even the first Prime Minister Nehru, when he gave the speech on Independence Day, that was broadcast through the radio. Right, that was broadcast through the radio. Even the current Prime Minister, many people listen to his speeches through the radio. So rather than the political climate is essential, but don't you feel that the role of technology also determines the kind of resistance we can have to attacks on the freedom of the media?
Short answer, certainly. This is a very good point.
Addition to short answer, absolutely. Technology gives the basic conditions. And in that case, I think we can be more hopeful today because we have a more interactive media system than when the radio was dominating. Today, we have more voices. It's easier to express yourself in public. So that is a positive ending of this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely true. We are part of some discourse at any point of the day. You either oppose that discourse or you are a part of the discourse.
With this, we have reached. I'll hand it over to Bijayji to conclude the session, but to my happiness that I've shared the dais with two of my very prominent colleagues, I would say, Professor Mooring, Professor Nigren, and Professor Wahlgren, and learned part of it. Accidentally, I've been a student of Eastern Europe and Central European contemporary history. So therefore, I could relate many of the things that you're talking about and connect them to India and what is happening in India at a larger, broader scale, so that discussion could go on rather than just do a very narrow process of discussion. With these words, let me thank all three of you and also Bijayji to help me moderate the session. Bijayji.
Rakeshji, if our panelists would like to have a last word, couple of sentences each, especially it has raised many issues like freedom of expression and technology, the contemporary context, the monopoly entering into Twitter, and how social media will impact the print media and the communication. So some such questions.
We have time. We have time. Because this is very important issue, and technology,
No,
Professor Wahlgren, has not even come at this moment. Professor.
No, I'm not saying we discuss these issues. I'm only saying underline the issues which we'll take up in the future discussions. For example, the issues raised about the repression and even the murders of journalists. Now it has two dimensions. One is fighting against the state, and the second is politics of discourse, how that is expanding, and this is a global phenomenon. The rightward, conservative, aggressive narrative at the level of people, as you gave the example of France. So these are some of the issues which have come up. Some are very specific to India, how we have to fight here in terms of politics of discourse, as well as the state's deviation from the spirit of the constitution. So that we can discuss later amongst ourselves. But with our international guests, if they could just tell us what they think should be the follow-up discussions, then we can have them in the future.
Fantastic. Professor Wahlgren.
Thank you. I noted, I don't remember who raised the issue, but the question of fairness. And if for future discussion, I would like to register my interest in the relation between the emphasis we've had also today on freedom of the press to the question of fairness of representation and the plurality of the public domain, the public debate. I'm worried that it's part of the Western fantasy since 500 years that technology is greeted with in the terms of the expectations. The promises of technology are often at the top of our practices of how to handle the emergence of new technologies, and often it's not very empirical. Our practices of implementing and distributing new technologies are often based on the promise more than on the empirical realities. And I think we would need to look into not only what happens to freedom of expression, but what happens to fairness of distribution of power in the media, and what happens to plurality of voices with the emergence of new technologies. I think that would be an area in which public power, democratic movements would need to deliver more in order to safeguard the foundations of deliberative democracy. So that's one issue in which I express my interest. Thank you very much for sharing with me, and I hope to see many of you again.
Thank you so much, Professor Wahlgren. Professor Nygren.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. I think I have learned something about the situation in India, and I think that it strengthened me in my opinion that freedom of expression is not given once for all. There's always a need of defending freedom of expression. And one of the important groups defending is the journalists and the media through professionalization, through professional organizations, and so it's important because freedom of media, freedom of expression is not only for journalists, it's for whole society. So it has to be defended all the time, also in Sweden. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we will have a session on this as to how to defend the journalists themselves. Professor Moring, do you want to come back on for the last time?
Very short, very briefly. I would like to not discuss it because we don't have time for it, but come back to your own question about how education matters and maybe broaden it up to the question on how the entire societal development is in a dialogue with the media. So one cannot say that there is a good situation for the media if there is not a good situation for democracy. And on the other hand, democracy can be severely hurt if the media does not perform its role in a proper way. And this is what I take home from our discussion today, which I was very, very happy I had the possibility to attend and to hear the voices, the many voices that we have heard today, that if you are going to discuss these aspects further, do not for one moment forget that it is a totality we discuss, totality which concerns the entire society and its development, and media as part of it, and in a dialogue with this broader development. And this makes the issue much harder, but also much, much more interesting. Thank you for today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. With these words, what is happening in India in a large scale, in a subcontinental scale, with a lot of diversity, enormous amount of things that you talked about, is that as a kind of vicious circle where the media is supposed to make the society civil, and the society and the media, if it's failing, then the uncivil society is making media uncivil. And so that battle itself is undergoing within media and society together. And that is one of the concerns that Rajiv Gandhi Foundation felt that it should address through inviting all of us together on one platform. With these words, I thank you again. Vijayji, you want to have a concluding statement, and we say hi and bye to participants?
No, concluding statement. Yours is beautiful. And we just pledge to ourselves that we'll do the follow-up discussions soon as possible. This is a month with death anniversary of Rajiv Gandhi. So we discussed technology and Panchayati Raj both, and also Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. So his idea of nation building. And then we again come back to the media. So we'll discuss the details later, but I'm really, it's not just a ritualistic thank. I'm really thankful to all of the participants who stayed till the end, and all the panel speakers who found time and were very patient with the questions and very insightful, very educative. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.